Over 5,000 years ago, Neolithic or New Stone Age man explored these swampy forest banks seeking out a site to settle. What physical factors determined his choice? How did the events of history impact on settlement? And how have these lands developed and changed in function over the centuries? To answer these questions, we're going to look at 5 uniquely different areas along the Shannon, reflecting 5 major eras in Irish history.
Ballybaru near Killaloe representing the pre-Christian, Clonmacnoise representing the monastic, Limerick the Viking, Athlone the Norman, and Shannon Newtown the modern.
The unique requirements of each period called for different site characteristics, and again there are 5 important site types.
Linking to pre-Christian and Ballybaru the dry point settlement, to the monastic and Clonmacnoise the nodal point settlement, to the Vikings and Limerick the defence point, to Norman times and Athlone the bridgepoint settlement, and to modern times and Shannon Newtown a dormitory settlement linked to an industrial estate. In this video we take a case study of each of these, looking particularly at the advantages and disadvantages of settling by a river.
A Neolithic farmer 5,000 years ago paddled his dugout canoe in here into the shores of Lough Derg near Killaloe, looking for a place to settle. What site characteristics would he have been looking for? Well, he would have been looking for 5 main things. Water, and there's plenty of that around here, with an abundance of fish and waterfowl. Fertile soil. The alluvial soils close to the river were the most fertile available. These settlers had learned to farm. They kept some livestock and cultivated cereal crops. Wood. 70% of the land of Ireland would have been covered in mixed forest at the time. So he would have had to clear the forests for farmland, providing plenty of wood for fuel and building. Transport would have been another important factor. He would have seen that just downstream at the present site of Killaloe, the river was shallow and fordable. So travel across the river as well as up and down was possible. His final and maybe most important requirement would have been a dry point, out of reach of the river floods, easy to build on and defend. His search stopped here on this large mound, where he built his primitive dwelling, and it became known as Ballybaru.
Through the next few thousand years it developed into a major ring fort, with massive earthen defences finally taking its place in history when Ireland's most famous High King, Brian Boru, ruled from here in the 10th century. Even though his palace, Kincora, was a bit downstream at the present site of the town of Killaloe, he took his name from Ballybaru, establishing it as one of Ireland's most famous ancient forts and dry point settlements.
Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra pax omnibus bone voluntatis.
Spread of Christianity in Ireland from the 5th to the 8th century saw the establishment of our second major type of nucleated settlement, the monastery.
By now, the criteria for selecting a site had become much more complex. Of course, they needed the same basics as the early settlers: water, wood, good fertile soil, and defence. So a river basin was a natural choice. Most Irish monasteries are situated in fertile river valleys.
But another important factor was now coming into play: communications, both within Ireland and internationally. For this reason, maybe more than any other, This site was chosen for Ireland's greatest monastic settlement, Clonmacnoise.
In the 6th century, it was the crossroads of Ireland. Running north-south beside it was the Shannon, which was the main traffic artery into the heart of Ireland. Running east-west, winding across the Central Plains, was Eiscir Riada, the great road of ancient Ireland. It met the Shannon at Clonmacnoise, defining it as a nodal point settlement, a point where two natural routeways meet. The 13th century Norman castle, about 400 metres south of the monastery, was built to protect the river crossing here. Clonmacnoise was not just a monastery, which by definition is a place of retreat. It was a university city, attracting students from all over Europe. The settlement spread far beyond the present boundary walls. Here, monks, students, writers, farmers and craftsmen intermingled, creating a great centre of social interaction and learning. This was Ireland's and the Shannon's golden era, with 7 major monastic settlements springing up on its islands and shorelines.
Clonmacnoise continued as a major settlement for 1,000 years until the 16th century. But unlike most other strategic nodal point settlements, it shrunk back to within the old walls and fell into decline. Why did the site of Clonmacnoise not develop into a major modern city?
It was undoubtedly a suitable site for its original function, an ecclesiastical settlement. But the primary functions of settlements change through the ages, and the sites that stand the test of time are the ones that can adapt. Clonmacnoise could not, for one basic reason: flooding. Although the monument itself stands on an elevated dry point, most of the land surrounding it is subject to annual flooding. It is located right in the centre of the most low-lying portion of the Shannon River between Athlone and Portumna. Here, the natural boundaries of the river are not its banks, but the bluff points which define the edges of the floodplain. In winter, the volume of water coming through Athlone is much greater than the carrying capacity of the river channel downstream. It inevitably flows over the riverbanks and engulfs the flat countryside, isolating houses and farms located within the floodplain. In some places, the river increases in width up to 100-fold. The only way to cure this flooding problem is to drastically increase the carrying capacity of the river. This could be achieved in one of 2 ways: by a significant deepening and widening of the river channel, or by the construction of high embankments or levees along either side of the river. The resulting river channel would have to be big enough to take all the water in a major flood without overflowing its banks. Because the river has virtually no fall in this midsection and the terrain is mainly bog, the excavation involved in either operation would have to be so large that the cost would be too great and damage to the environment significant.
It was once suggested that the only solution to Shannon flooding would be if one of the great heroes of Irish legend could lift County Leitrim, tilt the whole of the river, giving it the necessary slope.
Flooding has always been a fact of life around Clonmacnoise. The annals of the Four Masters record a major flood in 920 AD, when the waters reached into the abbey, and 22 years later an even greater torrent struck, and half the monastery was demolished by its force. Because of this propensity to flood and the low-lying boggy land surrounding the monastery, the site could not easily accommodate expansion. It was not an easy fording point or suitable for port development. It had no natural defence advantages, and so when the monastery declined, the focus of settlement moved 16 kilometres upstream to a site that had all these advantages: Athlone. The area around Clonmacnoise continues to flood, creating the famous Shannon Killaloes. No longer a human habitation, but one of the richest wildlife habitats in Europe, quickly becoming a great tourist attraction. The Viking Era and the foundation of the Shannon's first real city, Limerick. In 922, a fearsome band of Scandinavian warriors known as Vikings, led by their chief Tomar, sailed up the Shannon estuary. Their mission, plunder, death and destruction. Shannon Shores, with its great monasteries, was to prove a rich hunting ground. Their large seagoing ships eventually reached these shallows, known today as Curraghour Falls. They could go no further. They went ashore on the east side to discover that they were in fact on an island, about 1.5 kilometres long and a ½ kilometre wide, bounded on the west and north by the River Shannon, and on the east and south by a distributary known as the Abbey River. Tomar quickly realised he had discovered the perfect settlement location. Surrounded by water, yet located at the first fording point on the Shannon, with easy access to the surrounding countryside. The river teeming with fish, the countryside flat and fertile. High ground in the centre of the island, now the site of the 12th century St. Mary's Cathedral, providing a dry point and a commanding view downriver. And the river itself, the highway for plundering raids inland and trade with other Viking settlements in Western Europe.
He pitched his camp probably here, near the cathedral site on what is today King's Island, and thus laid the foundations of Limerick as a defence point settlement.
The Vikings held Limerick for about 300 years. For the early years, it was a nest of pirates dedicated to plunder. But after the defeat of the Limerick Vikings by Brian Boru in 977, they were then forced to concentrate on the peaceful activities of trade and commerce, which led to the development of Limerick as the first trading port on the Shannon.
But the defence function was to dominate Limerick's history for the next 700 years. In the 12th century, the Normans, the great builders, captured the city. They fortified it with stone walls, the most impressive being these.
King John's Castle is one of the most famous examples of Norman building in the country. It was built as a towering citadel to dominate the first fording point and later bridge point on the Shannon. By the 15th century, Limerick had developed into a fortified medieval city, with the ancient island site now called Englishtown, and across the Abbey River the Gaelic Irish built their Irishtown and fortified it with walls. This aspect of town building with an English and Irish town became common in the era, other examples being Dublin and Kilkenny. But it was in 1691, during the final stand of the Jacobite forces of James II against William of Orange, that Limerick as a defence settlement was to receive its decisive test. The Great Walls withstood the first siege of 1690, but in 1691, Limerick's defences fell, the medieval city was destroyed, and the Irish resistance finally signed away on Limerick's treaty stone. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, the defence function gave way to trade and commerce, and the city expanded and prospered. The River Shannon continued to serve Limerick, now more for trade as a deep water port than for defence.
But like most settlements located in river basins, Limerick occasionally suffers the main disadvantage of such a location: flooding. In the 1700s, floodwaters extensively damaged Limerick city. Great floods in the 1850s and again in the 1950s lasted months. The flood damage generally encountered in Limerick City is caused by surge tides and storms from the Atlantic.
The river is still tidal through Limerick and up to the power station at Ardnacrusha. Flooding occurs when a number of particular circumstances coincide. The river in flood. An extra high spring tide, which happens when the sun, the moon and the earth line up. And a weather chart that looks like this. A deep depression moving in over the west coast. This low pressure causes the tide to rise even higher. But by far the greatest influence is the occurrence of west or southwest gales which blow up the estuary, amplifying the tidal effect enormously. Just below Limerick, the great mass of water is funneled into a narrow channel, which again causes a rise in levels, occasionally high enough to enter the city and cause extensive flooding. But despite such setbacks, the city has continued as a thriving commercial business centre, with a population today of 70,000 people. Recent developments like the Arthur's Quay Centre, the City Hall and the new Shannon Bridge have spearheaded its architectural and cultural regeneration. Even though Limerick is an ancient city hardened in the pursuits of war, it is now a university city, moving proudly into the next century as a centre for technological research and a major gateway to the world through the estuary and Shannon Airport. The Norman Era and the birth of Athlone.
In 1169, the Normans landed in Ireland and, with superior military might, took over many of the old Viking towns. In the business of conquest, they were the great strategic thinkers. Their first move was to carefully select key settlement locations from which they could control production, marketing and transport of goods throughout the country. Their policy was then to build a walled town and defend it well.
The Normans quickly realised that this fording point, the Ford of Luan, or Athlone, on the mid-Shannon was the perfect settlement location. They moved in and built a defensive moat, and in 1210 took control of the crossing by building a castle and bridge, making this a bridgepoint settlement. Through a turbulent 800 years, that castle and a later bridge survived, and today define the centre of Athlone, Ireland's largest midland town. Athlone survived and grew because it satisfied all the key settlement criteria and could adapt to changing times. The site is high over the river, making it a dry point, out of reach of all but the greatest floods. It is right in the centre of Ireland, where a branch of Eiscir Riada meets the Shannon. It was natural that the main road across Ireland from Dublin to Galway should cross the Shannon here. It is therefore a nodal point, or meeting point of natural routeways. When river transport gave way to the railway in the second half of the 19th century, Athlone changed with the times and maintained its central location with the main railway to the west crossing the Shannon here. As a natural river crossing point, it has no equals along the Shannon. To the north of it is Lough Ree, 30 kilometres long, wide and inaccessible. To the south is 25 kilometres of callow and swampy riverbank. They converge at this shallow, narrow fording point, perfect for bridge building. Because of its strategic position, it has become a defence point settlement and has remained a garrison town down through the centuries. Today, Custume Barracks is the headquarters of the Western Command of the Irish Army. A look around Athlone today shows a town thriving on its strategic advantage. It is the administrative and commercial hub of the Midlands, with a government department, a regional technical college, modern high-tech industries, and the buzz of touristic life. And taking it into the 21st century as the major bridgepoint settlement on the Shannon is this new bypass motorway and bridge, a symbol of a settlement location adapting to the needs of the time and securing its future. Ireland's first new town, Shannon.
This is a windswept mound of earth on the north side of the Shannon estuary. It's not a dry point. In fact, the lands around here are particularly flat and marshy and subject to flooding. It's not a nodal point. This estuary out here is not particularly deep or suitable for navigation, and there are no roads or railways converging. It's certainly not a defence point. Why would anyone want to attack it or control it? And with 3 kilometres of water between here and the other bank of the Shannon, it hardly qualifies as a bridge point. Yet this boggy coastal strip to my left was chosen in 1959 as the site for Ireland's first new town.
The site for Shannon Town could only have been chosen in the 20th century, in the age of air transport. For this, it is uniquely qualified. As an airport site, it has few equals, flat, fog-free, and the first natural stop-off point between America and Europe. Between 1947 and 1957, almost half the aeroplanes that crossed the North Atlantic stopped over at Shannon, making it an international crossroads or nodal point. To exploit this newfound prominence, the government set up the Shannon Free Airport Development Company in 1959. The objective to develop industry, tourism and human habitation. The world's first industrial tax-free zone was immediately established, and soon this modern industrial park, with its generous tax and investment incentives, became a major manufacturing and trading centre. The Shannon area now had what many more traditional settlements were striving hard for: jobs.
But people need houses and convenient access to the workplace. So, just across from the industrial estate, here on Drumgeely Hill, a dry point. The first residential settlements were provided by Shannon Development in 1961.
This was the beginning of Shannon Newtown, a dormitory settlement for an industrial estate and an airport. Within 25 years, it would be a town of over 8,000 people. The site itself had few natural advantages. 3 30-metre-high drumlins gave some relief in what was otherwise flat slobland. To prevent flooding, a seawall had to be constructed, and a major drainage scheme with a pump house put in place to turn marshland into building land. Through the 60s and 70s, building continued with some stylish executive houses, like here on Tullyglass Heights, the top of one of the 3 drumlins that are the main feature of the town. Down in the valley between here and the sea are streets of less pretentious dwellings. Shannon is a planned town. It has a definite centre with a shopping and office area. Land has been clearly zoned around the centre for residential purposes, industrial development and amenity. A special feature of the town is the well-integrated urban forests, which are especially evident along the hillsides.
A town is more than a well-laid-out geographical site. It's about character, culture, tradition, a place to come from and be proud of.
Shannon is slowly developing this, as more and more of its residents are buying their houses and considering it home. Home by the banks of the Shannon in Ireland's first new town. 5,000 years earlier, our prehistoric ancestors found their home, a dry point overlooking the river called Ballybaru. The monks of Clonmacnoise knew the importance of transport and communications when they picked a strategic nodal point to establish their monastic city. The Viking invaders found natural protection on Limerick's island, where they established their defence point settlement. The Normans identified the crossroads of Ireland, Athlone, and made it a bridgepoint settlement. And in the age of air travel and international trade and commerce, the Shannon's unique appeal secured Ireland's first new town, the latest addition to the human settlement of a great river basin.